How did Buffalo Bill go from soldier to showman? Well, partly because of a New York City writer named Ned Buntline. And for those of you who aren't history nerds like me, you may be asking, who's that? And that's understandable because today S story is about a man who never wore a six-gun or chased outlaws. He made the Old West famous by telling its greatest stories. But how did he do it? Well, there are two ways. The first, through his pen. You see, before Hollywood and John Wayne and even radio, there were dime novels. They were cheap adventure stories that sold for a dime, just 10 cents. And these books were everywhere, sold in drugstores and general stores, on street corners and train stations. These stories were about soldiers, settlers, and yes, cowboys. And they made the American frontier come alive for people who'd never seen it. And no one wrote more dime novels than Ned Buntline. Our story begins in 1821 in New York City, where Edward Zane Carroll Judson was born, but he went by the pen name Ned Buntline. No one knows why he changed his name, but everyone knew his stories. The problem was he wasn't a cowboy, not an outlaw, and certainly not a frontiersman. He was a New Yorker. I mean, he was born in the city that never sleeps. He grew up among brick buildings, not cottonwood trees, and trolley cars, not stagecoaches. So how could he write about the Wild West if he'd never experienced it? Well, here's how. First, he read everything he could get his hands on about the frontier. Then he added a little imagination. It was the same technique that comic book writers use today. And if you don't believe me, go read any Marvel comic, especially the ones with Wolverine. And while Buntline might not have been a cowboy, he knew a good story when he heard one, and he collected them wherever he could find them. For example, he heard about a former hatter named Dick Turpin who robbed trains in Kansas. So Buntline wrote a story about him and published it in a small newspaper. Then one day, Buntline got an angry letter from Turpin. Apparently, the hatter didn't look or dress like Buntline described, nor did he live in Kansas. He actually lived in Texas, but the story still sold papers, so Buntline revised the details and made Turpin the outlaw he's remembered as today. See, sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, or maybe fiction is just better advertising. In fact, Buntline was already an experienced fiction writer by the time he ever visited the frontier. As a teenager, he left school and ran away to sea. He served briefly in the U.S. Navy, but soon tired of sailing. He tried other jobs, clerk, peddler, journalist, but none of them satisfied him. So in 1847, he began writing stories and selling them to cheap magazines. At first, he wrote about anything and everything, politics, sports, even fashion. But his best stories were about adventurers and outlaws. That's because New York City was full of them. There were Irish immigrants fighting in gangs, African Americans escaping from the South, and con artists trying to make a quick buck. All Buntline had to do was walk down the right street and listen to the right people. And before long, he was writing the wildest stories New Yorkers had ever read. The problem was, nobody paid much attention to them. See, the 1840s and 50s were a pretty wild time. There was the Mexican-American War, the California Gold Rush, and the rise of the Communist Manifesto. People didn't have time for adventure stories, or if they did, they couldn't afford them either. Books were expensive, newspapers were crowded, and magazines were all the rage. But those didn't last long because advertisers soon discovered that if they covered the pages with pictures, people would spend more time reading them. That meant magazines became glossy and expensive. But then came the solution. What if magazines were printed on cheaper paper, sold for less money, and packed with thrilling stories instead of fancy illustrations? The answer, of course, was yes, and soon the dime novel was born. The 1860s were the golden age of dime novels, and at the center of it all was one man, Ned Buntline. He churned out story after story about soldiers and sailors and almost every kind of adventurer you can imagine. One critic counted 59 titles alone, and that was just in 1864. Some of his characters were real, like Confederate spy Rose Greenhow or Civil War widow Helen Viola. Others were completely imaginary, like James Haight, the son of a wealthy family who runs away to join the circus. But whether his characters were real or imagined, Buntline made sure they were memorable. He gave them names that stuck, like Texas Jack O'Mora and Prairie Dog Bob. He dressed them in colorful clothes, and he sent them on daring adventures. He wrote about Pony Express riders delivering secret messages and wagon train bosses defending settlers against Native American attacks. He wrote about riverboat gamblers, prison wardens, and army scouts. He even wrote about Daisy, a girl who disguises herself as a boy and joins the Union Army. Not only did these dime novels sell, they made the Old West famous across the country. And here's the irony. Ned Buntline never set foot west of Illinois until 1867, but that all changed when Buntline's publisher asked him to take a trip to Colorado. While he was there, he met a man named William F. Cody, a former hunter and soldier who now worked as an army scout. Buntline saw the potential of the man instantly. Although he didn't see him as William F. Cody, he saw him as Buffalo Bill. You see, Cody was already famous for killing buffalo, or rather shooting them from an airplane. Okay, that part isn't true, but he was famous nonetheless. And Buntline knew that if he published a story about a real man like Cody, it would make both the character and the story more believable. So Buntline and Cody became fast friends. They rode the frontier together, hunted buffalo, and Buntline gathered stories for his next dime novel. But here's the thing. While Cody was a great source of information, he didn't exactly make for a great character. That's because Cody was humble, shy, and soft-spoken. But Buffalo Bill needed to be brash and boastful, someone that readers could root for. So Buntline took some inspiration from the man he met and created a hero the nation would love. And that's why the first mention of Buffalo Bill in print appeared in a Buntline story called The Scouts of the Prairie, published in 1869. From there, Buntline continued writing about Bill Cody, and the stories quickly became his most popular. That meant more work, more fame, and more money for both of them. In fact, Buffalo Bill was so grateful to Buntline for turning him into a hero that he agreed to star in a play based on Buntline's stories. And let's just say the transition from page to stage wasn't entirely successful. The play was called Scouts of the Prairie, too, and critics hated it. One reviewer said, "It is scarcely possible to conceive anything worse than Mr. Buntline's play," while another called the acting execrable. But audiences didn't care what the critics thought. They packed the theater night after night to watch Buffalo Bill ride his horse across the stage and fight his battles against the Indians. That success led to bigger shows in bigger cities. And before long, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was a sensation across America. Its most famous stars were Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and yes, Ned Buntline, who played the part of the dime novelist. He might not have been a cowboy, but for the rest of his life, Ned Buntline was known as the man who made the West famous. Now, this is only part of the story, because Ned Buntline was almost as wild as the characters he wrote about. He was a heavy drinker and a notorious brawler. He had fistfights with Mark Twain and Bret Hart, and he brawled with cowboys in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In fact, he was arrested for assaulting an actress, and Buffalo Bill himself had to bail him out. And that was only one of Buntline's legal problems. You see, as the West grew, so did the number of people who thought Buntline was making it up. Miners claimed he stole their stories. Settlers accused him of lying about Native Americans. And even Buffalo Bill grew tired of Buntline's drinking and his constant need for money. Still, Ned Buntline kept writing, and he kept producing hits. He published more than 200 dime novels and dozens of plays. And he never stopped collecting stories until his death in 1886. Today, his grave is in Buffalo Bill's grave in Deadwood, South Dakota. And that's fitting because without Ned Buntline, the West might have stayed in the West. For more about the real Wild West, check out the series on this channel. It's all about the cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, and Native Americans who really made the West famous.